So why should you learn Greek, Latin, other ancient languages, ancient Middle Egyptian, Sanskrit, medieval Italian, modern French? Um, I'm not actually going to try to answer that universally, but why should you learn other languages? I particularly want to answer the question: why should you learn ancient languages in respect of the great books? Um, there are other languages, if you're kind of reading a classic great books curriculum, that you might want to have that aren't Latin and Greek, Hebrew, maybe Middle Egyptian, just about. That you could go for medieval Italian. I've already mentioned is an obvious one for Dante and Petrarch. If you're becoming a real polymath, people like C.S. Lewis, had all these languages to some degree or another. In some cases, really only flirting with them, but you get the idea. They really knew a lot of languages and they used it to study these classical materials. Greek and Latin are the big ones to consider because the bulk of non-English language texts in their original, if you're reading a great books curriculum, are in Greek and Latin. I say Dante and Petrarch, add Tasso, if you like, and a couple of others, and that's medieval Italian done, and that's probably the most relevant other one actually. Maybe early modern French would be the other one, but really, Greek and Latin provide so much of that list, and yeah. The question is, as I say, you could expand some of what I'm going to say to these other languages and to languages that have nothing to do with the Western canon and great books, to Sanskrit, to whatever. An easy answer, a very useful answer for why. Basically going to give a few reasons and talk about what I think the main reason for learning Greek and Latin are. And then I'll just very quickly, relatively speaking, talk about what resources I've used, or and they're not necessarily the best, but here's some resources you could get. Here's a very obvious reason you often get is you learn about the roots of language. Greek and Latin are much more important ultimately than medieval French, early modern French, obviously. Certainly more important than Sanskrit or medieval Italian in terms of direct lineage with lots of important things. You recognise roots. This is a really obvious one. If you have Greek, you know the difference between hyper and hypo. So the difference between hyperactive, hypodermic, etc. Oh, that's interesting. The same with dermis. You know what a dermis is. You know what an activus is. What about to take Latin greetings? If you know vale, part of the root of valedictory. Vale is essentially farewell. Be strong. Valedictory. Dicta. Words. These are the valedictory speech is a farewell speech, isn't it? Salve for salvation. Salve is is a sort of hope you're well as you greet someone. And this is interesting. And I'm giving, you could say, well, I don't really care about that, but of course you learn so much about the structure of language, and you learn about how grammar works in other languages that aren't English, and in languages that influence a very large number of Western languages, and which kind of are systematizing. They teach you a lot about how grammar works systematically. So there's all this interesting linguistic stuff. Another relatively minor reason, but an interesting one that some people will really value, I really value this actually, is the way I talk about systematizing, is that learning ancient languages is highly systematizing on the brain. You're learning it as a reading language, basically. You may learn to speak it, but you're learning it as a reading language. And you're learning it without the pressure of it needing to be commercially relevant. No one nowadays. Well, at one point, Latin, even into the 20th century, Latin could be a lingua franca. That's an Italian. That's a Latin term. It's a language. It was a lingua franca amongst intellectuals separated by language. But it had stopped being really the universal elite language by the 17th and 18th, particularly the 18th century, really, where you start to see French in that context. And since then, English become the global elite language that people communicate it with. And that will change again and again over time. But Latin for a long time was that. and yeah, it's something where you're not going to get that benefit, but of it being modern relevant now, but you can systematize and discipline your mind with a highly structured, highly I don't know, a very elegant and serious language, and intellectually testing language that is nonetheless easy to pick up. So that's a good reason to learn. So number one, you learn a bunch of stuff about linguistics. Number two, it helps shape your brain. But I think this is the main reason. Look, translations are great when we're reading the great books. We're usually going to be reading translations, most of us. When we read it, we're reading an expert's go at something, though, their view. The expert doesn't himself get 100% of the atmosphere and nuance of a text. Even if he gets 95% of the plot and character stuff, he's only getting 60% of the character and nuance. I'm talking about, like, these are upper limits. This is just like the best translation ever. And he's so that's not to say that translations can't be reliable, or that with a great deal of work, and particularly when you have kind of iterations by different people who know what they're doing, you can get an awful lot of what's going on. But I'm just saying, there's a certain limit to not. There's what is one thing being a native Greek, hearing the oral version of Homer's Iliad, to reading Homer's Iliad in Greek, to reading it in translation. You get the idea. And the translator is also an imperfect writer. He gets half of the vibes across that he gets, and he reduces the plot and the character work as far as he can express it. And I is actually an example, reading, I think it's Cooksen's translation of the Oresteia, plays by Aeschylus. I was struck by the fact that his when he was translating hexameters, and the main characters talking, it actually worked basically okay. But when he's translating choral songs, it was often pretty shaky, and the poetry became worse. Not just in terms of what you thought, not just in terms of how easy it was to understand, but also the poetry became worse, because obviously he was struggling with the form. And that was a perfectly decent translation, not the worst ever, by any means. On the other hand, Robert Fagel's translation of the Oresteia has a great deal more kind of very powerful poetic lines. Guy with a very strong poetic instinct. And I found this maybe most in the Agamemnon rather than the other two, but he just was really struggling at points. It was pointed out with by people I was reading this with, that you had entire passages, of translation where it wasn't clear who the subject was, because the way he translated it to get the maximal poetic effect, his writing it actually distorted the So those are good translations, but just to give examples of the struggles even a good translation can face. And we aren't usually about to become experts, so maybe it sounds like the translation is the better bet. I've said that, but you and I, we're not going to become the single greatest Greek scholars ever, even if we work very hard. So maybe the translation is always the better bet. We're not going to vastly improve our reading, perhaps by translation. But I think it's to probably misunderstand what I mean to say, well, it's simply about accumulation of information, and kind of just being able to add up the percentages of vibes and plot and the rest of it. I'm just going to give a couple of examples. I'm going to give the first 7 lines of the Iliad, the first 10, 11 lines of the Aeneid. So the Iliad, big epic Greek poem by Homer about the Trojan War, about Achilles. And the Aeneid is a Latin poem about Aeneas, the last Trojan, basically going off to found Rome. So I'll read those, and I'll read the translations immediately after. So Greek, English, Latin, English. And this is just a case of hearing. This is both Fagel's translations, actually, by the way, very good, respected modern translations. So this is the Iliad. Menin, Aide, Thea, Poleideo, Akaleos, Ulomenain, Hey, Muri, Chaos, Algae, Etheke, Polas, Ho, Themus, Sukas, Ioi, Priamsan, Heroin, Autus, Dei, Eloria, Toike, Kunasin, oinosi te pasi ios, or dios, de eteleto boule, ex u te ta prota, diastenein epis ante, Atreides te enas, anaron kai dios achilleus. Apologies, of course, for the mispronunciations and the sloppinesses and so on. The point is, you get that's hearing the Greek, isn't it? Hearing across the centuries, badly spoken, but hearing the Greek. And here's in English: Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion. Feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. Here's the start of the Aeneid. Arma virumque Cano Troiae qui primus ab oris Italiam fato profugus lavianque venit. Littora multum ille et terris iactatis et alto vi superum seve memorum Eunonis ob Iram. Multa quoque et bello passus dum conderit urbem, inferitque Deos latio genus unde Latinum. Albianique patres atque altoi Marinia Romae. Musa mihi causus memora quo numine leso, quidve dolens Regina Deum tot volvere cassus, in signem pietate virum tot edire labores, impoleret tantene animis caelestibus ire. And here's Fagles. War and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soils. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, and many losses he bore in battle too, before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, sources of the Latin race, the Alban lords and high walls of Rome. Tell me, muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged? What could wound the queen of the gods with all her power? Why did she force a man so famous for his devotion to brave such rounds of hardship, bear such trials? Can such rage inflame the immortal's heart? So the two English poems, in some respects, though there is a difference in tone, they sound similar. They're translated by the same author, which in a sense is cheating, but it helps us recognise a similarity across any English, really, to do with sound, the sonosphere, the soundscape. There's a difference in how the languages sound based on morphology, based on grammar, based on the way in which, because Latin is partly because Latin and Greek are so-called inflected languages, where you inflect the ends of words, which creates a very regular pattern of ways that words end in terms of how poets tend to then start using them. The way that poetic feet are used. This is stuff you don't need to know about for the purpose of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can hear the difference, right? Arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris. Wars and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. Now, it's not just that you understand the Latin because it's in English, it's also that the rhythm of the Latin is different in quality. The way it works is different. And the same with Mainin, Aide, Thea, Polea, Deo, Achilleos is different. To rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles. So Peleus' son Achilles there, which is Peleiadeo Achilleos, rather than Peleus' son Achilles. The way we emphasise things, Peleus' son, different word there, whereas here we're hearing it's the Achilles of Peleus. The entire way the grammatical form works is different. So just, there's something there about the way that once you start to pick up some of what's going on in the language, even a tiny bit, as I say, from an amateur perspective, you go like, oh, okay, that is a slightly different vibe. Yes, it gives much the same information. You don't want to exaggerate and say, oh, they didn't even know the concept of sons. No, it's that rather than upfront just using huios as an example, the normal word for sun, you have a different effect, a different use of words. And again, in terms of the way that Latin and Greek and the way that you write poetry in them, if you can write poetry in them compared to how we write poetry in English, the sound and the way that emotion is expressed is different. And certainly there is things like Latin is a better example for this. I think that you get a bit of this in Greek, but with Latin, you have such common use of inflected word endings as pegs along the way that when we're reading poetry, and it's true in prose as well, but we're talking poetry here, that where we think of like, rhyme or particular metrical things, the Latin poet is just thinking of completely different sets of things. So you start to pick up the compression, the precise sounds of Latin, the liquidity of Greek, the way these different types of languages sound, the way the poetry sounds. So we can imagine a little bit more of Achilles' own environment from the Achilles. We have the raw images, either better or worse translated, but as we hear the poem in Greek, we're one step close to hearing Homer sing Greece out of its dark ages. We're beginning to time travel, basically. And we also have, as an example, the motific adjective in Greek is another good example of this. So wine dark, Homer speaks of the wine dark seas, oinops pontos, wine dark sea. Oinos there being wine, pontos being sea, basically the wine sea. But it's being used as an adjective. So wine dark. Tamer of horses, one of the great compliments that have been given someone, and that Hector is particularly given, hippodamos, tamer of horses. There's a thing about those motific, and now wine dark sea and tamer of horses, very famous English translation choices, and very good ones, absolutely. But there is nonetheless just a different thing. This sense, as I say, you're travelling across the Oinops Pontos to see the hippodamos. Suddenly it's a different thing, isn't it? And perhaps it's the fact that you realise that as you start, this is why I say time travel. Any language you learn is space travel in a sense. By that I mean you're learning a tiny bit about how French or Mandarin speaking people think, some of the habits of mind, and this is a bit of that kind of classical cliche. Did you know the Inuits have a million words for snow? Well, they do think about snow a lot. In a way, that's almost not, I'm sure the Inuits have more interesting things to say than to talk about the snow in a million ways. We English, and this doesn't apply to all English speakers, but we English have many words for rain. Culture, context, language, all of these shape how we think and what we can speak about. But yeah, we just get some of that sense of having travelled both across time and across space to a different people who just, the way the word feels, the emotion they apply to it, the emotion you get from hearing it is just slightly different to what you expected. And we also gain nuance. This is, I'm going to give a Greek New Testament example here. So American translations, things like the New International Version, the English Standard Version, New American Standard, they tend to, not always, but most American translations translate the word doulos. Paul will talk of himself as a doulos of Christ. They'll translate doulos as bondservant, whereas a British translation will usually go for slave. Now, a bondservant, in typical English usage in both England, Britain and America, and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, a slave we think of as someone who has no freedom, is simply chattel. We think of chattel slavery. A bondservant, if we know the word, and if we don't, we can say, what's a bondservant? Oh, you're serving a bond. Okay. It's actually there in the etymology. A bondservant is someone who, perhaps out of debt or some other reason, has ended up in service and has to pay off that bond. Bail bondsman in America, similar thing. Someone who is paying the bond for someone to leave, fronting the cash for someone to leave prison. Now, why is this? Why do Americans do this? Is it they found a great new translation for what Paul is saying? Well, no, because Paul, the common usage of slave that most people in Greek-speaking cities in the Roman Empire who he's writing to, Greek-speaking Jews and Gentiles in those early churches, they are not thinking of debt slaves. They will be aware of debt slaves, but many of them will be thinking, nearly all of them will be thinking first and foremost of chattel slaves or in Roman service. Some of them will be chattel slaves in Roman service, and some of them will have been freedmen, either themselves freed or they are the children of freedmen. And American translators are concerned to draw out the fact that Roman chattel slavery compared to up to 19th century American chattel slavery are different experiences with different political connotations, the way they are perceived, the way they're received in history. They don't want to affirm 19th century chattel slavery when Paul, for instance, seems to accept Roman chattel slavery as a fact of life. Now, we're not debating here Paul's views. What I mean is what he means either way, but what I mean is that people say, so he says this and that means that he's affirming this. And actually it's correct of the American translator to realise, no, there's more complication than that. And so they make a translation decision, which seems to be about distancing it from a misinterpretation, but actually probably also hides something. Whereas slave is probably the better word, but you can see why someone would think this is going to be prone to genuine misinterpretation, because you just assume all your own baggage into, it's like turning up in a foreign country. I'm thinking about the time at Ben Gurion Airport where I, without thinking, ordered a cheeseburger. And I wasn't greatly offended when I was told I didn't have a cheeseburger. But the point was that I had briefly forgotten that, in foreign countries they do things different for religious reasons, for cultural reasons. I remember being in Strasbourg and wanting to go to the art museum there, and we found out it's shut twice a year. On Christmas Day and on Paschal Tuesday, and of course we're chosen to go to the Tuesday after Easter. It's because it's an Alsatian holiday, traditional Alsatian festival day. I didn't know that, and I'd misunderstood the place I was in, and I had my own expectations. And translation consists of those expectations being put on the page, and usually they are good ones by competent people, but you're sometimes going to be tricked by them. So stepping back into an ancient language frees us up to breathe the same air and atmosphere as our author, just a bit more. It can separate us from our temptation to force everything to be relevant to today's social context. Imagine trying to convince... Now, I'm sure St. Paul would think he had things that were relevant to people today. I'm sure Cicero would. I'm sure Thomas Aquinas would. I'm sure Homer would, in fact, in terms of the things he thought were standbys and commonplaces of all human experience, which there are many of in his works. But the point is that they would not think that they were speaking directly to anything in our situation, anything specific to our situation. Well, what about inflation in fiat money economies in the 21st century? What did this ancient philosopher have to say about that? Oh, get a life, But the point is, this is our temptation. We always think that everything is going to fit our situation. It's a bit like how we hear a song and we think, that song's just about my situation. And you're like, no, it's not. Imagining hearing Layla and thinking that's just how I love my girlfriend. It's like, oh, is your girlfriend the wife of another famous rock star at the time you're writing this? I don't know. The point is, we can treat the past as a foreign country, if we would like to, rather than as a source of material to just turn into more of ourselves, rather than assimilating it, just making it a biomatter to prove our own points. We can treat it as a foreign country with respect, trying to learn the culture, however alien it is to us, however sometimes unpleasant it might be, and the language helps us do this. So I think the biggest, I gave 3 reasons. 1, linguistic trivia knowledge. 2, it's just good mind discipline like Sudoku. But 3, the most important thing is it's a way of time traveling, space traveling, to be amongst these writers just a tiny bit more, to understand them just a tiny bit better, in a way that we can't if we are siloed in our own time and our own language. So, some resources. The Latin, I've used a few Latin books. The one I come back to is Wheelock's Latin. I used the 7th edition. This is an all-in-one book, this particular book I have. It's a long all-in-one book, but it's for 600 pages or something, but it has 40 lessons, 40 chapters, that is to say, and it gives you question and answer, as well as a systematic grammar approach, which I prefer and I think is basically better for learning languages as an adult for the purpose of reading. This is don't use Duolingo for this purpose. Basically, I think is the usual advice. There can be value to things like that, but basically, you want to learn things systematically. You want to just learn how do you say the first and second conjugation. The first chapter, I think, in Wheelock is first and second conjugation verbs. Well, you learn what a conjugation is, and you know that's an important thing, and you learn the typical way that Latin patterns itself very quickly, even if there are many things you haven't learned. You're like, okay, typically there's going to be different endings to words. Sometimes you'll learn quickly. There's augments in the middle or at the start of words in these languages. You start to learn more and more of this, and you build up a system. So that's a better way, I think, to learn learn the grammar. And there are self-marking exercises you can do. You can read in the back, and then there are translations from Latin as well. So Wheelock is good. I actually, for some reason, just it's in the stack. I did. This is Middle Egyptian. It's not Greek and Latin, but this is by James P. Allen, second edition of An Introduction to the Language and Culture of Hieroglyphs. I audited a module on this, and I've come back to it occasionally since. I've just been reading it again. I don't remember anything. This is a comforting thing with Middle Egyptian. I've looked at the stuff a couple of times. I don't remember anything when I next go back to it and practice a few chapters or whatever. But the purpose of it is to just scratch back the sand a bit and just think, okay, I'm a tiny bit closer. Not much, but a tiny bit closer. Greek. Got a couple of Greek. There's a complication with Latin. You can learn. There are a few courses out there which learn Church Latin. I think you're going to be better served by learning chiefly classical Latin and then adapting it. There are complications that basically, I should say, that with Latin, you have a lot of change into late antiquity, and you get texts you might be interested in that are in Latin, medieval texts, which are very specifically dense anyway. So things like Thomas, and which is part of the reason actually not to learn it that way, but it's the reason why people are tempted to. They're like, I want to learn, for religious reasons, I'm interested in kind of Latin, so I want to learn the Latin Mass, I want to read Thomas. I'd still probably say learning a generic Latin course, which will start with classical Latin, and having your first long Latin texts be gimmies, like Caesar is a massive gimme, writing very simple, clean Latin, stepping onto your Ciceros, your letters to Atticus, things like that. And then progressing from there. If you're to become really good at the stuff, it takes time and it takes a lot of effort. You're not going to be able to do it like I studied for 6 weeks and I could read Thomas. It's not going to happen. So it's better to do it the longer way, but the better way. Another way of Latin, actually, I've got, before we move on to Greece, where there's different problems. I've done a couple, Cambridge Latin course, I've used a bit, and it's certainly, and there are similar courses. These are more programmatic than systematic. They're like, here you're going to learn. They will tend to begin to learn some grammar rather inductively. So, for instance, here you have this. This is, by the way, a secondary school starter book. You have Caecilius est pater, Metella est mater, Quintus est filius, Clemens est servus, Grumio est coquus, Cerberus est canis. Grumio est coquus is obviously the basis, by the way, of the plebs character, for those interested. Caecilius est in tablino, Metella est in atrio, Quintus est in triclinio. So the point is that you're learning both a bunch of words, and here you're learning the dative case. You then begin to you learn est, is, as a verb on its own. You don't learn any other form of est. You just learn he is, and then you begin to learn a bunch of third person singular verbs: labrat, scribet, sedet, and then so it gives you some stuff where there is a sort of semi-systematic choice of words, but you're not learning a paradigm to start with. You're just learning how to translate a bunch of words and a bunch of things, and you get vocabulary at the end, and you need to learn that words and phrases. Sedet means sits or is sitting. Servus means slave. Atrium means hall. Canis means dog. So you're learning just the word. You don't learn the rest of to sit in any form. You just learn sedet. So Cambridge Latin course is one version of that. Another version of that is, which this is what I use with my boys, is Minimus. There's a bunch of stuff. There's Minimus is an awkward one in a way. This is from Cambridge, basically because these pupil books you can get for very cheap on eBay, typically in Britain and even in America. These teachers' books you just got to wait because you're buying them for new for I think £75 or £80. I have not spent that on the teachers' books I've bought, but you just need to wait and bid. But they are similar approaches where gradually they introduce grammatical concepts of, do you notice how when you're talking to someone, when you're asking them to do something, it's sede to sit, sedete, sit to many. So you learn these basic points of grammar. It's maybe very slightly more grammatical early on than Cambridge Latin, even though Minimus is simpler than Cambridge Latin. But yes, Minimus is good fun. The boys like it a lot, and I would say if you're in a situation where you're like, but I'm going to teach my kids a language. I've learned some of it, or I'm going to learn it with them. It's good in the same way that it's good not to worry too much about remembering all the stuff yourself, unless you really are, I'm going to practice this every day kind of person. Especially with kids, the point is to give them the vision into a different world, not to make them expert Latinists. Minimus Secundus is the slightly more serious equivalent to really Cambridge Latin, which it is moving on in Latin. It is immediately more complex. It kind of assumes you've done Minimus, and this one introduces. It does explicitly give grammatical paradigms. So Minimus Secundus. Similarly, they both have DVD CDs for listening to things. That's fairly common in this. I think Wheelock's Latin, for instance, has a similar thing. Greek, you have an issue basically, which is that you need to decide, and there is enough of a difference for it to matter in terms of how you're going to learn, whether you want to learn classical Greek or New Testament Greek. And New Testament Greek is a subset ultimately of ancient Greek. They're both and classical Greek describes actually several dialects that are similar enough that you can learn them as one. When you're learning classical Greek, you're basically learning Attic Greek, Athenian Greek, because that is so dominantly the dialect you're reading in if you're reading classical Greek, and even into Hellenistic Greek, it's so often the base dialect of literary Greek. But Koine, common Greek, New Testament Greek, is the everyday writing language without being super literary of the first century. For New Testament, I prefer the systematic approach. So again, the thing I go through every few years, Duff's Elements of New Testament Greek. I have been using the 3rd edition. Again, systematic. You learn paradigms of, this is your amo, amas, amat stuff. You're just learning how to say I say. You say, he says, that kind of thing. And then you learn nouns, and then you learn adjectives, and then you learn the bits and pieces. And that's going to set you up to read a lot of Hellenistic Greek, but particularly it's going to set you up to read the New Testament, which is one of the most significant documents in that era of Greek writing. And Duff or any other New Testament Greek book is going to gear you specifically towards picking up on common phraseologies and common usages in the New Testament. Now, the limitation there's not really any kind of, can I just study how Greek was generally written from 200 BC to 200 AD or something, or 300 BC to 300 AD. New Testament Greek, in a sense, is almost the nearest thing to that. But you're not going to be fully prepared for going to complex literary texts beyond the New Testament by doing that. You're going to be better prepared actually by studying classical Greek, and then in the same way we talked about Church Latin, specialising on into it. And for my classical Greek work over time has been the Joint Association of Classical Teachers, which is Cambridge, which is called Reading Greek, which is a 3-book course, text, grammar, vocabulary and exercises, and an independent study guide if you're doing it on your own rather than learning it with a teacher. The reason it has this separation between text and grammar, vocabulary and exercises is it has a particular format, which is that basically you read stories and you're running translation and then learn grammar. It has a slightly different system. So, for instance, the imagine, you're given this and you're told, okay, part 1, Athens at sea. Dicæopolis, this introduction says, towards the harbour of Athens, Piraeus. On board ship, a criminal plot is forwarded, and then the story of the naval battle of Salamis is recorded while the ship passes the island. As the ship comes into port, the Spartans launch a surprise attack. It's set during the early part of the Peloponnesian War, which began in 431. And it gives sources from Demosthenes, Plato, a comic fragment, Lysias, Herodotus, Homer, etc. Time to be taken, 5 weeks, 20 sessions at 4 sessions a week. And then it says, look, you should translate. Basically, you just then just have a Greek text. The toploion estin en Byzantio, ende Byzantio, etc., etc. It's at Byzantion, the Athenian colony. Later, Byzantium, we think of it, and Constantinople, and so on and so forth. And then what you're doing is you're using a different book to translate it. You're using the vocab that's attached to that lesson, and then it gives you, for instance, it does teach you the alphabet, in fact, in here. But running and learning vocabularies, it gives you vocabulary to use and then vocabulary to learn from that section, and then it starts giving you running grammar. Okay, now while you're reading this, think about this grammar as you go. It's going to help you decode stuff. So it's teaching you systematically, because it is just offering you, as a systematic is, it gives a bit of program, just learn these words, but then it's very quickly into system. Learn this way the grammar works, because it's going to apply everywhere else. So it's a bit of a hybrid, and some people prefer that. I think it gives you a great experience of just reading Greek, basically, of getting used to reading a lot of Greek in a way that, say, Duff, for instance, and it's the same with any of these. Any systematic approach gives you very short sentences first and very, very, very short sample texts at first. Oh, this thing from Mark or this thing from Cicero, but it's only like a very short sentence. And yeah, as you get further on, you get to have a paragraph or so, but often they're having to give you running vocabulary anyway. That's very common in these. Is in Duff and in Wheelock, you get running vocabulary. So. So you're not actually translating the passage systematically. You're still having a bit of help. So I think the JACT reading Greek method does just admit that. The flip side is it's not as thoroughly systematic early. Very quickly, the only Hebrew I've very briefly looked at. I should learn Hebrew really, but the only Hebrew I've briefly looked at, because my wife used it to study, is Introducing Biblical Hebrew by Alan P. Ross. There's some other resources. You can get dictionaries for Middle Egyptian, for instance. You'll probably end up with if you're studying it seriously, with a big hardback dictionary, the same for Biblical Hebrew, basically because in those cases you're talking about something where the script is so alien, comparatively, like as in it's because it's either set ideogrammatic originally in Middle Egyptian or uses an entirely different script in Hebrew. Whereas even Greek, as we think of it, the alphabet, is similar enough to ours and uses values, the idea that a letter both looks like ours very often, not always, but often enough, and it has the same kind of value as our letters do. It has a sound, a, b, whereas others are syllabic or whatever. And in fact, this is one thing, of course, Linear A, the original Greek script lost in the Greek Dark Ages, is syllabic rather than alphabetic. Anyway, so that's some thoughts on why you might want to study classical languages to get deeper into the great books, and also just a bit of an amateur set of suggestions about books you could look at, and also, even if you're not looking at these books, how to apply standards and what kind of things to look from other self-teaching resources. You can also, of course, pay someone to teach you, but I'm assuming that most of us aren't doing that. Anyway, share your tips, your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next time.